Elemental crit is bad, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Since a lot of us are at the end game and are looking at building our optimum sets, I'm going to show you how damage is calculated, what this means for our builds, and at the end, I'm going to share some tools that'll help you make better builds. So let's get into it. You're watching the topic hole, and this is how damage is calculated in Rise. The formula they're using in Rise is similar to the one in Worlds, but with a couple adjustments. We'll get into the changes in a little bit, but first, let's talk about the formula. So there are two parts to it. The first is Raw, and the other is Elemental. For Raw, this is how it's calculated. We aren't going to worry too much about the class modifiers since they're things like charge levels, but you're probably wondering what a motion value or a hit zone value is. A motion value basically shows how much damage an attack will do. The bigger the number, the bigger the hit. This is balanced so slow moving weapons like the Greatsword will hit harder than faster moving weapons like dual blades. Each attack is a different motion value, and knowing which ones do more damage can help you figure out your combos. Hit zone values. This is how we know which part of the body will take more damage. Motion values were different for each attack a weapon has, but hit zone values are only looking at the type of damage that you do. So these are going to be cutting from a sword, impact from a hammer, or shot from one of the guns or a bow. If you want to find motion values, they're actively being mined and tested by people like myself, which I'll have a link to down in the description. But hit zone values were given to us this time by Capcom. You can find them by going into the Hunter's notes, and they show up after you've killed a monster. We'll get to it later, but these hit zone values are built into my damage calculator. So next, we have sharpness or distance modifiers for ranged weapons. Does bow still count as range still? You can see that once your weapon gets below yellow sharpness, your damage will really start to drop. So try to stay above yellow if your weapon is at green sharpness, and try to stay above blue if you have white or blue sharpness. Next, we have our crit modifier. This starts at 25% more damage whenever you crit, and it goes up by 5 for each level of crit boost that you have. So one thing to note is crit boost only modifies the raw portion of your damage. If any of this has been helpful, go ahead and hit the like button, and if you like the content on the channel, go ahead and subscribe. Now that we know what goes into it, let's see it in action. I have a build with 125 raw, crit boost level 3, green sharpness, and I'm attacking the training Tetranodon's belly, which has a raw hit zone value of 60. The attack I'm using has a motion value of 10, and so I do 11 damage on crit, and 8 damage normally. We're only talking about the first hit, which has a motion value of 10, but the second hit has a motion value of 8. The next part of the equation is elemental, then we'll talk about which skills you should prioritize in order to get the most damage out of your sets. We're going to be adding this portion of the damage to the raw to get our total damage at the end. A lot of these parts are the same as the raw. Elemental sharpness doesn't have as significant of an increase to damage as the raw part does, but it's still important, especially when you put them both together. There isn't really a motion value for elemental damage, but I've noticed that all attacks are being multiplied by a modifier of 67, and I'll link to the program I created to test this in the description. Since the game is still new, not all motion values are correct, but I'm going to be updating them as time goes on. Next, we have the elemental hit zone values, which there's going to be one for each element. This is the best way to see a monster's elemental weakness. And just like the raw portion, this is going to be a percentage in our calculation. Next, we have our elemental crit modifier, and this is one of the biggest damage changes that has come from Rise. Every weapon starts with a base elemental crit of 100%, instead of them being different for each weapon type. I think this, with the 67% modifier to elemental damage, is their attempt to make elemental viable for all weapons. If you don't have elemental crit on your build, only the raw portion will crit. And with each level of elemental crit, the elemental part will go up by 5%. Just like with the raw build, this damage will be rounded to the nearest integer or whole number. Alright, let's see it in action. I'm going to continue using dual blades to stay consistent and to show that elemental crit really has changed. This set has crit boost 3, elemental crit 3, a raw of 215, and 32 dragon. I'll be using the same move as before on the training dummy, and it has an elemental hit zone of 30. I'll do 30 damage on a crit and 22 on a non-crit, which is exactly what my calculator shows. Now let's talk about which skills are the most important. If you're making a raw build, then you should of course be trying to max out attack boost and get all 3 levels of crit boost. But for elemental, you should focus on maxing out your element, then your crit boost, and then go for attack before getting elemental crit. And here's why. Elemental crit only increases the elemental portion by 5% per level, and depending on your build, you won't even see an increase in your damage. Let's take these builds for example. Even though one has crit boost 3 and elemental crit 3, it's only doing 1 more damage, and that's only when it crits. The other build only has crit boost 1 and 5 points in attack boost. This is increasing not only the damage you take when you crit, but also the damage when you don't. So build 2 is going to do more damage than build 1. So there are a few different programs that are going to be helpful for you when you're trying to make new builds. The first is the model I made and I've been using in this video. It lets you see how much damage you do per hit, and the other is the grinding lands. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I did help with some of the calculations. This will help you make sets, compare them against each other, and so that you know which one is better before you make them. You can find links to both in the description below. The grinding lands uses EFR and EFE, and if you want to learn more about them and what you should be paying attention to, check out my tips in the description below. This is the first of many videos I want to post going over how Rise works, so if you're interested, subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.